Deep in the Brazilian Amazon, where the Tapajós River runs dark as coffee and wide as a lake, there stands a water tower. Rusted now, its paint peeling in long strips like sunburned skin, it rises above the jungle canopy with words still barely visible on its side. Ford. The name of the man who built it. The name of the dream that died here. Below that tower, if you walk through the strangling vines and push past vegetation that has spent decades reclaiming what was stolen, you will find something impossible. American-style bungalows with screened porches, their mesh now torn and hanging like cobwebs. A hospital with examination rooms still intact. Medical equipment rusting in the humid air. Fire hydrants standing at corners where no cars have driven in 70 years, their red paint faded to a ghostly pink. Dance halls where big band music once floated through open windows, drawing workers who had traveled 1,000 miles for wages that seemed like fortunes. This is Fordlandia, and the story of how it came to be, how it thrived and burned and broke the heart of the richest man in America, is a story about what happens when one man believes his money can remake the world. It is a story about hubris and ambition, about cultural collision and natural resistance, about the particular kind of madness that seizes men who have never been told no. It begins, as so many American stories do, with a problem of supply. The year was 1927, and Henry Ford had a crisis on his hands. His Model T had transformed America, putting the entire nation on wheels, fundamentally reshaping how people lived and worked and dreamed. But every single one of those wheels rolled on rubber. Rubber for tires. Rubber for hoses and gaskets and belts and seals. Rubber for the countless components that made an automobile function. It was the lifeblood of the industry Ford had created, and he needed oceans of it. But here was the trouble that kept Ford awake in his Dearborn mansion, staring at the ceiling while his wife Clara slept peacefully beside him. Nearly all the world's rubber came from British and Dutch plantations in Southeast Asia. Plantations that had been built with seeds smuggled out of Brazil decades earlier by a British adventurer named Henry Wickham. The Europeans controlled the supply. The Europeans set the prices. And the Europeans, Ford was convinced, were bleeding American industry dry through a combination of monopoly and manipulation. He was not entirely wrong in this assessment. Rubber prices had quadrupled in just 5 years, driven by schemes to restrict supply and maximize profits. Ford Motor Company was spending over $30 million annually on rubber alone, a staggering sum that represented pure dependency on foreign powers. For a man who had built his empire on vertical integration, on controlling every aspect of production, from the iron ore in his mines to the finished automobile rolling off his assembly line, this dependency was intolerable. It violated everything he believed about how industry should work. Ford owned his own forests for lumber. He owned his own ships for transport. He owned mines, railroads, glassworks, and rubber plantations in his own country. But Brazilian rubber trees would not grow in Michigan, no matter how much Ford wanted them to. The trees needed tropical heat, tropical rain, tropical soil. They needed the Amazon. So Henry Ford, at 64 years old, already the most famous industrialist in the world, conceived of a plan so audacious it bordered on madness. If the rubber would not come cheaply to him, he would go to the rubber. He would carve a piece of America out of the Amazon jungle. He would build not merely a plantation, but a city, a model community where rubber trees grew in orderly rows, where American workers and their Brazilian counterparts would live in American-style homes, eat American food, play American sports, and produce rubber by the shipload. He would prove that American methods could conquer any environment, that American determination could overcome any obstacle. He would call it Fordlandia, and he would pour more money into it than any private American citizen had ever spent on a foreign venture. To understand why Ford believed he could succeed where nature itself seemed hostile to such ambition, you must understand the man himself. By 1927, Henry Ford had already accomplished the impossible several times over. He had democratized the automobile, transforming it from a rich man's toy into an everyman's necessity. He had revolutionized manufacturing with the assembly line, making mass production a reality for the first time in human history. He had doubled his workers' wages to $5 a day when competitors paid half that, creating overnight the American middle class that would define the 20th century. Failure was not a word that held meaning for Henry Ford. He had bent steel to his will. He had bent markets to his will. He had bent society itself to his will, reshaping how Americans lived, worked, traveled, and thought about their place in the world. Why should a jungle be any different? It was merely another problem to be solved, another challenge to be overcome through the application of money, machinery, and American know-how. The Brazilian government, desperate for development in its neglected interior, practically threw land at him. For a token payment and promises of infrastructure, Ford received a land grant larger than the state of Connecticut, 2.5 million acres of virgin Amazon rainforest stretching along the Tapajos River, one of the Amazon's great tributaries that eventually feeds into the world's mightiest river system. The concession gave Ford rights to everything: the land, the trees, the minerals beneath, even the right to build towns, operate utilities, establish schools and hospitals, and maintain his own police force. It was, in essence, a private kingdom in the heart of South America, and Henry Ford intended to rule it according to his very particular vision of how human beings should live. The first ships arrived in 1928, carrying equipment, supplies, and a small army of workers who had no idea what awaited them. They had been recruited with promises of adventure and good wages, told they would help build something unprecedented in the jungle. What they found when they stepped off the boats was a wall of green. The jungle rose from the riverbank in an impenetrable mass, trees soaring 200 feet into the humid air, their canopy so thick that the forest floor existed in perpetual twilight even at noon. Vines as thick as a man's thigh strangled everything, creating a three-dimensional maze of vegetation that seemed to have no beginning and no end. The air itself seemed to sweat, heavy with moisture that condensed on skin and clothes and equipment within moments of arrival. And through it all came sounds that the Michigan men had never imagined: the screams and cries and rustles of millions of creatures hidden in the green darkness. The Americans had never seen anything like it. Most came from the flat farmlands and orderly factory towns of the Midwest, places where nature had long since been tamed into submission. They stepped off their boats into a world that seemed designed by some malevolent force specifically to kill them, and it very nearly did. Within weeks, the first cases of malaria appeared, brought by mosquitoes that swarmed in clouds so thick they darkened the air. Then came yellow fever, spread by different mosquitoes that bred in the standing water created by the rain that fell almost every afternoon like clockwork. Then typhoid from contaminated water, and dysentery from food that spoiled within hours in the heat, and a dozen other tropical diseases for which these men from temperate climates had no immunity, no preparation, and no defense. The company doctor, a well-meaning man who had trained in American hospitals and thought himself prepared for tropical medicine, watched helplessly as workers collapsed with fevers that spiked to 106 degrees. Men who had been healthy and joking at breakfast were delirious by lunch and dead by dinner. The cemetery that Ford's planners had included in their tidy blueprints, never expecting to need it so soon, began filling with graves. Each wooden cross marked another worker who had believed in Ford's vision enough to follow it into the jungle. But the work continued. It had to. Ford had invested millions already, and more millions flowed from Detroit every month. He had promised rubber to his shareholders, to his suppliers, to himself. Failure was not an option, even if success seemed to retreat with every passing day. The clearing began with axes and machetes, the same tools that had cleared forests for centuries. But the Amazon was not like the Michigan forests that Ford's contractors had flattened to build his factories. The trees here were ironwoods and mahoganies, hardwoods so dense their timber sank in water, so resistant that axes bounced off them like toys. Saws dulled and broke against trunks that seemed made of stone. The tractors that had cleared Michigan forests in days sat useless in the mud, their caterpillar treads spinning helplessly against roots that had grown for centuries. Men worked in heat that reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity so intense that sweat provided no cooling relief, their bodies slowly cooking in the thick, still air beneath the canopy. They wore long sleeves and long pants despite the heat, trying to protect themselves from insects and thorns, and watched as their clothes rotted off their bodies within weeks, eaten by the moisture and the mold that grew on everything. The jungle fought back with everything it had. Army ants invaded the workers' quarters in columns millions strong, their jaws capable of cutting through leather, stripping the flesh from any creature too slow to escape their advance. Vampire bats descended at night in silent clouds, their razor teeth making incisions so precise that sleeping men did not wake as their blood was lapped away. Jaguars prowled the edges of the clearing, their golden eyes gleaming in the firelight, occasionally carrying off dogs or pigs and leaving bloody trails into the darkness. Snakes dropped from branches onto workers' shoulders. Spiders the size of dinner plates made homes in boots left unattended overnight. Everything was trying to kill them. The water carried parasites. The air carried fever. The ground itself seemed to suck at their feet, trying to pull them down into graves of mud. And yet, impossibly, a town began to emerge from the chaos. By 1930, Fordlandia had transformed from a muddy camp of misery into something approaching the vision Ford had conceived in his air-conditioned office 4,000 miles away. Neat rows of American-style bungalows lined graded streets that could have been transplanted from any Michigan town. A hospital rose 3 stories high, equipped with the most modern medical technology money could buy, including an operating theater, dental offices, X-ray machines, and wards for both men and women. Generators hummed day and night, providing electricity to a corner of the world where most people had never seen a light bulb. A commissary stocked American goods shipped at enormous expense from ports in the north. A water tower provided running water to every home, a luxury unknown in most of Brazil. A sawmill processed lumber from the very trees workers had struggled to fell. A machine shop repaired equipment. Churches offered salvation to workers whose souls felt tested by the jungle's indifference. Schools offered education to children who had never seen a book. Swimming pools provided relief from the heat. Golf courses provided recreation for managers. And through it all, through every aspect of daily life, Ford's representatives enforced Ford's rules. This is where the dream began to fracture. Because Henry Ford did not merely want to grow rubber in the Amazon. He wanted to grow Americans. The workers who came to Fordlandia, mostly Brazilian laborers recruited from the impoverished northeastern states, where drought and poverty drove families to desperation, or local caboclos who lived along the river in harmony with the jungle's rhythms, found themselves subject to an alien regime. Ford, who had never visited the Amazon and never would, who had never met a Brazilian and showed no interest in doing so, had decreed from his office in Michigan that his workers would live as Americans lived, whether they wanted to or not. Alcohol was absolutely forbidden. This was the Prohibition era in America, and Ford was a fervent, almost fanatical teetotaler who believed alcohol was the root of most human misery. Workers who were found with liquor, or who returned from trips to nearby towns with alcohol on their breath, were immediately terminated and expelled from company property. There would be no cantinas in Fordlandia, no celebrations with cachaça, no escape from the jungle's pressure through the ancient solace of drink. Workers were required to live in company housing, assigned based on their job classification and marital status. They were required to eat in company cafeterias, banned from cooking their own meals. They were required to submit to company rules governing every aspect of their lives, from the hours they worked, to the recreation they enjoyed, to the poetry they could read. They were assigned identification badges with numbers, like factory equipment. Their homes were subject to inspection at any time, with managers checking for cleanliness, prohibited goods, and proper American behavior. And the food. The food was perhaps the cruelest imposition of all. Ford, a passionate advocate of American nutrition who had strong and eccentric opinions about diet, insisted that workers eat what he considered healthy: hamburgers and hot dogs, whole wheat bread, canned peaches and pears, oatmeal, and spinach. Never mind that these Brazilians had lived their entire lives on rice and beans, manioc flour, fresh fish from the river, fruits and vegetables that grew in their own gardens. Never mind that many found hamburgers disgusting, that the heavy American foods sat like stones in stomachs accustomed to lighter tropical fare. Never mind that canned peaches could not compare to the mangoes and papayas that grew wild in the jungle around them. Ford knew best. Ford always knew best. The Brazilian sun rose at 6 and set at 6 year-round, with almost no variation this close to the equator. But Ford's managers insisted on maintaining Michigan hours, with time clocks and punch cards and rigid schedules that made absolutely no sense in a place where the midday heat made outdoor work impossible. Men were expected to labor through the worst of the afternoon, when the sun pressed down like a physical weight and the air shimmered with heat rising from the ground. Then rest during the cooler morning and evening hours when they could have been genuinely productive. And the houses. Those neat American bungalows with their metal roofs, so charming in a Michigan suburb where summer lasted 3 months and winter brought relief, became ovens in the equatorial heat. The tin roofs absorbed the sun's fury all day and radiated it downward all night, turning sleeping quarters into saunas that made rest impossible. Workers who had lived their whole lives in airy palm-thatched dwellings, structures designed over centuries to allow tropical breezes to flow through and heat to escape, found themselves gasping in buildings engineered for a climate 4,000 miles away. Resentment built slowly, like pressure in a boiler. The workers needed the wages, desperately in many cases. Jobs were scarce in the Amazon, and Ford paid well by local standards, 3 times what a laborer could earn elsewhere, if he could find work at all. Many sent money home to families who depended on their sacrifice. They endured because they had to, because the alternative was poverty and starvation, because even this strange American prison was better than no opportunity at all. But the daily humiliations mounted. The tasteless food that Ford insisted would make them healthy. The ridiculous rules that Ford's managers enforced with religious zeal. The condescension of Americans who clearly believed they were bringing civilization to savages, who could not be bothered to learn Portuguese, who laughed at local customs and beliefs, who treated their workers not as partners in a great enterprise but as raw material to be shaped into proper, productive units. The breaking point came in December of 1930. The company had recently instituted a new policy. Workers would be required to eat in the cafeteria, with meal costs deducted automatically from their wages whether they ate the food or not. For workers already struggling with the alien cuisine, already resentful of 100 other impositions, this was too much. It started with a thrown plate, then another. Then the tables went over in crashes of splintering wood and breaking china. Windows shattered, the kitchen was invaded, supplies thrown into the mud, and suddenly, as if a dam had broken, hundreds of men were pouring into the streets with machetes and knives, smashing everything that bore the Ford name, venting years of accumulated rage against the alien power that had taken over their lives. They burned the generators. They destroyed the time clocks. They overturned equipment and set fire to storage buildings. They hunted for American managers with a fury that suggested murder was not beyond possibility. The managers fled to the river, piling into boats and pushing off into the darkness, while Fordlandia blazed behind them. They watched from the water, terrified and uncomprehending, as their carefully constructed town dissolved into chaos. The Brazilian military eventually arrived and restored order, arresting ringleaders and establishing a presence that would prevent future violence. But the message was clear to anyone willing to hear it. You could not impose Michigan on the Amazon. The jungle had its own rules, and the people who lived there had their own ways of life. Ford could buy the land, but he could not buy the souls of those who worked it. He could clear the forest, but he could not clear away centuries of culture and custom. Henry Ford received the news in Dearborn with something between disbelief and fury. His response was characteristic of the man. He would simply try harder. More money, more managers, more American determination to overcome Brazilian resistance. The workers wanted different food. They would learn to appreciate American nutrition and its benefits. They resented the rules. They would learn discipline and be grateful for it. The jungle was hostile? He would tame it as he had tamed every other obstacle in his path. But the jungle had other ideas, and what came next would prove that Ford's greatest enemy was not his workers' resistance, not the climate's cruelty, not even the insects and diseases that had already claimed so many lives. His greatest enemy was a fungus too small to see with the naked eye, and it was waiting in the leaves of the very trees he had come to grow. In the years following the riot, Fordlandia entered its most productive phase, and simultaneously, its most troubled. The managers made some concessions to local custom. Workers were allowed to cook their own food, though they still could not drink alcohol. The most rigid scheduling requirements were relaxed slightly. The open rebellion had forced even Ford's stubborn managers to acknowledge that some accommodation was necessary. And trees were finally being planted in the numbers Ford had envisioned. Row after row of rubber trees stretched toward the horizon, their young trunks straight and green and promising. Company agronomists spoke optimistically of harvests to come, of latex flowing in milky streams from carefully tended trees, of the day when ships would carry Fordlandia rubber to Detroit by the ton, freeing American industry from foreign dependency forever. They did not understand what they were doing. They did not understand that they were creating the conditions for a catastrophe that would dwarf everything that had come before. In the wild Amazon, rubber trees grow scattered through the jungle, one here, another 100 yards away, separated by the incredible diversity of the rainforest. Between any two rubber trees might stand a dozen other species: mahogany and Brazil nut, kapok and jacaranda, each with its own community of insects and birds and microorganisms. This spacing is not accidental. It is survival. It is the result of millions of years of evolution in an environment where predators and parasites lurk in every shadow. Because there exists in the Amazon a fungus called South American leaf blight, a microscopic killer that feeds exclusively on rubber trees. In scientific terms, it is called Microcyclus uli, but names matter little. What matters is what it does. The fungus releases spores that land on rubber tree leaves and germinate, sending tiny threads into the plant tissue, feeding and spreading and releasing more spores to float on the wind to other leaves, other trees. An infected tree cannot produce latex efficiently. A heavily infected tree produces almost no latex at all, and a catastrophically infected tree simply dies, its leaves falling, its trunk standing bare and skeletal in the green jungle. When rubber trees grow scattered through the forest, separated by the vast diversity of other species, the fungus cannot spread easily. Each tree is an island, protected by the ocean of other vegetation surrounding it. The spores float on the wind, but they rarely find another host before they die. The fungus persists at low levels, a constant pressure that the trees have evolved to tolerate, but never an epidemic. But Fordlandia's rubber trees grew in neat rows, just like crops in Iowa. Branch touched branch, leaf brushed leaf. The canopy formed a continuous carpet of green that was actually a carpet of targets for the fungus that had been waiting in the surrounding jungle for exactly this opportunity. And when the blight arrived, as it inevitably did, it found paradise. The first signs appeared in 1933. A few trees in one section showed withering leaves, yellowing and falling out of season. The company botanist, a man named James Weir, examined them and recognized the symptoms immediately. He had read the literature. He knew what South American leaf blight looked like, and he knew that once it appeared, it was almost impossible to stop. His warnings went unheeded. The managers reported to Detroit that a minor fungal problem had been identified and was being addressed. They did not want to alarm Ford. They did not want to admit that the entire project might be fundamentally misconceived. Perhaps it would be different here. Perhaps the blight would not spread as the experts predicted. Perhaps American determination could overcome even this invisible enemy. Within weeks, the fungus had spread to a dozen sections. Within months, entire hillsides of rubber trees went brown and bare, as if touched by some invisible fire sweeping through the plantation. The spores spread with terrifying speed, carried by wind and rain from tree to tree, row to row, finding not scattered victims, but a feast laid out specifically for them. Company scientists tried everything. They tried sprays and dusts that had worked in Asian plantations, only to discover that fungicides developed for different climates were useless against a fungus that had evolved in the Amazon for millions of years. They tried grafting resistant rootstock from surviving trees, hoping to breed immunity into future generations. They tried adjusting the spacing, planting trees farther apart, but not far enough apart to matter. They tried planting on higher ground, on the theory that the blight preferred the humid valleys and might spare the breezy hilltops. Nothing worked. The fungus found every tree. The fungus killed every tree it touched. Year after year, the harvests disappointed. Reports to Detroit grew increasingly evasive, full of promises about next year, about new techniques, about improvements that were surely coming. The trees that survived the blight produced poorly, their energy drained by constant assault, their latex thin and insufficient. Accountants in Dearborn calculated the cost per pound of Fordlandia rubber and found it was many times higher than simply buying from the British plantations Ford had hoped to undercut. The entire economic rationale for the project was collapsing, and still Henry Ford refused to quit. This was, perhaps, his greatest flaw, the inability to admit defeat, the conviction that sufficient willpower could overcome any obstacle, that problems existed only to be solved through the proper application of American ingenuity. He had been right so many times before, against such long odds. He had proven the doubters wrong so many times before. Surely the jungle would yield, as everything else had yielded, to Ford determination and Ford resources. In 1934, Ford made a decision that seemed bold at the time, but would ultimately prove to be merely a more expensive form of the same failure. He would start over, not at Fordlandia itself, which was too infected to save, but at a new site 50 miles downstream, a place called Belterra. The land there was higher, better drained, supposedly less hospitable to the fungus. The soil was better suited to rubber. The lessons of Fordlandia would be applied, all the hard lessons paid for in dollars and lives and broken dreams. Belterra rose even faster than Fordlandia had, because Ford's engineers were now experienced in tropical construction, knew the tricks of building in the jungle, understood at least some of what the Amazon demanded. More bungalows went up, better designed this time, with thatched overhangs that provided shade and ventilation. More infrastructure appeared, schools and hospitals and swimming pools and all the amenities that Fordlandia had struggled to provide, and more rows of rubber trees were planted, millions of them, with scientific precision and careful attention to spacing. By 1940, Belterra had surpassed Fordlandia as the center of Ford's Amazon operations. The older town began its slow decline into jungle relic, buildings abandoned to the vines and the weather, workers transferred downstream to the New Hope. Everything Ford had learned at Fordlandia would be applied at Belterra. This time would be different. But the blight found Belterra too. Of course it did. The fungus cared nothing for elevation or drainage or careful planning. It was part of the Amazon, an integral piece of the ecosystem that could not be removed or avoided or outsmarted. Anything planted in the Amazon in dense monoculture rows would feed it, sooner or later. The harvests at Belterra were better than at Fordlandia, but still nowhere near enough to justify the investment. The dream of rubber independence remained exactly that, a dream that receded further with every passing year. Then came the war, and everything changed. In December of 1941, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia with stunning speed and overwhelming force. Within months, they had captured the British and Dutch rubber plantations that supplied 90% of America's rubber. Singapore fell, Malaysia fell, the Dutch East Indies fell. Suddenly, the warnings Ford had issued for 2 decades came true in the worst possible way. America was at war, and America had almost no rubber. You might think this would have been Ford's moment of vindication. He had been right all along about the danger of depending on foreign rubber. He had seen this vulnerability years before anyone else took it seriously. He had tried, at enormous personal expense, to build an alternative source. Surely now his foresight would be recognized. His investment would pay off. His jungle dreams would save the nation. But the cruel irony was that his alternative had failed just when it was needed most. Fordlandia and Belterra together, at the peak of their production, produced barely enough rubber to manufacture tires for a few hundred cars. The American military needed enough for millions of vehicles, plus aircraft and ships and countless other applications. Ford's investment had proven that natural rubber could not be grown economically in the Amazon, at least not using plantation methods. The land refused to be farmed like Michigan. The fungus refused to be defeated by American ingenuity. The dream refused to become reality. The war was won not by Amazonian rubber, but by synthetic rubber, developed frantically in American laboratories and factories. Scientists who had been working on the problem for years suddenly found unlimited funding and urgent priority. Within 3 years, American plants were producing enough synthetic rubber to supply the entire war effort. Ford's jungle kingdoms had become irrelevant, a sideshow to the main event, an expensive experiment that had taught one lesson above all. Some things cannot be done no matter how much money you throw at them. By 1945, Henry Ford was 82 years old and failing. A series of strokes had diminished the once indomitable industrialist, leaving him frail and confused, a shadow of the man who had terrorized competitors and inspired workers and reshaped American life. He had turned control of Ford Motor Company over to his grandson, Henry Ford II, a young man who had grown up in luxury and had no sentimental attachment to a jungle folly he had never seen and could not understand. The end came quickly once the decision was made. In late 1945, with the war over and synthetic rubber triumphant, Ford Motor Company sold Fordlandia and Belterra back to the Brazilian government. The price was $250,000, a token fraction of the estimated $200 million Ford had invested over nearly 2 decades. No rubber was included in the sale, because there was barely any rubber worth including. The American workers went home to the temperate lands they had never stopped missing. The machinery was abandoned or sold for scrap. The bungalows and hospitals and schools and water towers were left to the jungle that had been waiting patiently all along, never doubting that its time would come again. Henry Ford died 2 years later, in April of 1947, having never once set foot on the land that bore his name. He never saw the water tower with his name painted on its side. He never walked the streets his money had built. He never met the workers who had labored and suffered and died trying to make his vision real. The Amazon had defeated him utterly, completely, finally, and he went to his grave refusing to acknowledge it. To the end, he insisted that Fordlandia would have succeeded if only his managers had followed his instructions properly, if only the workers had been more cooperative, if only the weather had been kinder, if only fate had been fair. The failure was never his vision, never his fundamental misunderstanding of what the Amazon was and what it demanded. It was always someone else's execution, someone else's weakness, someone else's fault. But the town remained. The jungle advanced slowly, but the buildings still stood, monuments to an ambition that had overreached itself. And what happened to Fordlandia in the decades after Ford's death may be the most haunting chapter of all.